Good afternoon. My name is Ted Catchy. I'm a fellow of the Medieval Institute, and I direct the Center for Italian Studies and the Devers program in Dante Studies at Notre Dame. And I'm deeply grateful to the director of the Medieval Institute, my colleague Tom Berman, for the honor of introducing the third and final speaker in this special edition of the Conway Lectures series, this year dedicated to the theme of Dante and medieval studies, or medieval studies in Dante. I probably got that upside down. On the occasion of the 75th anniversary since the founding of Notre Dame's Medieval Institute, which coincides with this year's worldwide commemorations, let's say, of the 700th anniversary of the death of Dante Alighieri. Simon Gilson, the Agnelli Serena Professor of Italian at the University of Oxford, is a great teacher, an inspiring scholar, a generous colleague, and a good friend, I should add, to Dante and Italian studies at Notre Dame. His scholarship and teaching range across Dante, medieval and early modern studies. He also likes short introductions, so I'll be brief and just mention his principal works: Medieval Optics and Theories of Light in Dante, Dante and Renaissance Florence, and most recently in 2018, Reading Dante in Renaissance Italy, Florence, Venice, and the Divine Poet. We thought we knew about Dante reception in the Renaissance, and then Simon went and showed us how much more there was to know, and his work on Dante's Renaissance reception has opened up many new avenues of study and stimulated a real burst of new work in the field of Italian Renaissance literary history, as has the AHRC-funded collaborative project that he has recently headed, Petrarch Commentary and Exegesis in Renaissance Italy, 1450 to 1650, which I think can be said to be at the absolute forefront of contemporary scholarship on Petrarch and of the digital humanities in the fields of Italian and Renaissance studies. His current project is also in the area of Renaissance Italian studies. Together with Dario Brancato, he is working on an edition, translation, and commentary of little-known philosophical works by one of the most interesting and complicated humanists of the 16th century, the Florentine Benedetto Varchi. But this afternoon, Simon returns to Dante and his philosophers. Please join me in welcoming Simon Gilson.
Thank you, Ted. Thanks very much for that warm and generous introduction, as always. And it's a real pleasure to be here, to be invited here to give one of these lectures. I'm just really sad that I can't be with you in person and have real-time contact with colleagues at the Marvelous Medieval Institute and with other friends and colleagues at Notre Dame, including Ted, as well as with the other speakers whose talks I very much enjoyed last night. But to have real-time company and conversation with them and others, maybe we can create something of the feel of that later during the roundtable session. So my talk is called, rather plainly, Dante's Philosophers, and the title probably needs some explanation. What I want to do is to give some sense of the liveliness, complexity, the richness of the medieval world of ideas, or worlds of ideas, with which Dante interacted, and to offer some sense too of the sophistication and originality with which he dealt with these stratified worlds, above all in his poetry. As I try to do this, I'm going to obviously address some of the problems, live issues, difficulties, even dead ends in exploring this kind of topic, this field of study and related ones. But I don't want to get too distracted, too bogged down by treating Dante as thinker, or to add more layers to what I think is really a hoary trope, that of Dante the philosopher. It's a designation, Dante the philosopher, that risks being freighted and distorted, both by Dante himself, who in a very particular context, in a highly strategic way, Ted knows better about this than anyone, called himself the least of all philosophers. And it's a designation, Dante the philosopher, that risks being freighted and distorted too by reception histories of the figure of Dante in his poem. Reception histories, and I'm using the plural advisedly, that since the first commentaries of Dante's two sons, and then through 14th, 15th, 16th century commentary tradition and beyond, have applauded Dante's philosophical qualities, Dante is illustre filosofo, ottimo filosofo, dotissimo filosofo, eccellentissimo filosofo, an illustrious, excellent, most learned philosopher. In some parts of this reception history, these constructions stress and praise Dante's abilities as a philosopher more than his qualities as a poet, where at one level, I'm going to be doing, I think, the opposite, but you tell me at the end. I also don't want to get too distracted by any attempt at full-scale reconstruction of Dante's philosophical positions. I'm not sure I'm in a position, I'm not sure anyone is really in a position to do that in spite of all the scholarship and effort. Though I will, of course, touch on the question of his overall approach to philosophy and some of his predilections. So one of the reasons for these restrictions of focus is that in Dante, it is always the poetry that comes first. One can't really stress enough how astonishing, how avant-garde it was for Dante to choose vernacular poetry for his great poem, the Commedia. That's the first point. Second point for these restrictions of focus is that we always need to take into account how in articulating and responding to the worlds of ideas, Dante does that through poetry. He does it through imagery, similes, metaphors, dialogues, through the highly nuanced handling of characterization and narrative context, above all with the major characters in the poem, Virgil, Statius, Beatrice, who often speak in a pronounced philosophical way. Crucial too is the way that within Dante's poetry, we find a broader system of internal echoing and recalling, of modifications, retrospections, fulfillments of various kinds. And I hope to use my talk on Dante's philosophers to look at how when Dante makes reference to certain philosophers and then makes further allusions to them later on in the poem, those later references are articulated in a system of echoing, recalling, modifying, retrospective qualities and some fulfillments. So it's in that spirit then that I want to keep the focus on how Dante's texts speak to us, and above all, how he presents characters in the poem who either appear as philosophers at particular moments and in particular contexts, or else pronounce more philosophical. And it's in this spirit too that I want to maintain a focus on how across the poem, Dante persistently, passionately, and poetically restages previous positions and issues from new perspectives. Of course, for Dante as poet, philosophical terms, concepts, and teachings are deep informing structures of the poem. Remember that hell is built in large part on a moral doctrine derived from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. The central doctrinal cantos of Purgatory, 17 and 18, stress again a moral doctrine that is built on Aristotelian ethical teachings, but is also based on a theory of perception that has its roots in Aristotle's On the Soul. And that the third cantica, the third realm of the Dantean afterlife, the paradise, is constructed in large part on the model of an Aristotelian Ptolemaic cosmos, in which souls descend to each of the 8 planetary heavens in a kind of Christianized rereading of passages from Plato's Timaeus. I'll say more about that later. It's not only a matter of philosophy deeply informing the structural principles and moral architecture of the poem. The poem's presentation of what we might call physical doctrine, and Dante does this so brilliantly. He's the hero in Italian poetry of these things, of describing landscapes, weather effects, natural and cosmic phenomena, what our bodies are and do, how they function, how they relate to their souls, both in life and after death. All of these phenomena in Dante, even if it doesn't seem like it, sometimes have a rich philosophical underpinning. What's more, and at a further level, the central messages of the poem are developed in sustained poetic argument with increasing frequency and density from Purgatory 15 onwards. I'm thinking here of the discourses on all kinds of topics that have pronounced philosophical underpinnings, discourses on human freedom, the shade body, the cosmological order, the vow, as we saw last night, the resurrection of the body, the imprescrutability of justice, the status of the virtuous pagans, predestination, the fall, the language spoken by Adam and Eden, angelology, just to name a few. So philosophical ideas in Dante can, in short, never be detached from the poetry. They're not abstractions. They give structure, texture, and verisimilitude to a text that still gives us goosebumps today, that narrates one living man's journey through the afterlife, a journey whose penitential parabola, with its meetings, experiences, and dialogues, shapes the voice of that living man, that emaciated political loser, Dante, who at the end of the journey retells and reshapes as poet his experiences. A poet who cries out with a divinely prophetic voice to humanity to reform itself, to rethink the political and spiritual realms and their interrelationship. And as Christian Merves has taught us so eloquently, a poet who calls out for humanity to be and do better. So philosophical ideas in the poem are also concretely rooted in a set of intellectual practices and mental habits, usually identifiable with Latin literate learned environments that we tend to associate with the late medieval university or the convent school, the studium of the religious orders. Of course, these are environments to which Dante was an outsider, in spite of what he says in one passage, but whose materials, concerns, and debates he nonetheless somehow assimilated deeply, minutely, and personally, even if he did so in a kind of characteristically freewheeling, yet discriminating way as a poet. So as we know, what stands in the background to the place of philosophy and philosophers in Dante is a veritable intellectual revolution brought about by the translation and recovery of Greek and Arabic scientific and philosophical texts. Above all, but not only, the recovery of Aristotle's works between the early 12th and mid 13th century. That translation wave had kind of more or less happened by the time Dante was born. What hadn't finished was their difficult, often highly fraught and contested accommodation of this scientific and philosophical learning, this rational scientific philosophical learning to Christian teachings. And on the back of this, in the late 13th century, I'll come back to this point at the very end, these translations witnessed the recovery of the figure of the philosopher in some milieu. So my concentration is going to be mostly with Dante's masterpiece, the Commedia. What I want to do is explore what Dante poet calls the philosophica familia, the philosophical family, in the first circle of hell, and to see how he then picks up three of these philosophers, Aristotle, Plato, and Averroes, in subsequent namings or allusions, and then move on to a final end section, concluding section, where he turns to another 24 wise spirits in the heaven of the sun, who are also called a family, and include at least one prominent contemporary philosopher. But first, I want to give a few before I turn to the Commedia, I want to give a few preliminary remarks about philosophers who are named in other works. First, the Vita Nuova, and then the Convivio, those two remarkable self-commentaries. And in doing this, I want to give a few kind of points of orientation on some questions of Dante's early formation and the period both before exile and just after exile. So nearly all of the first 35 years of Dante's life, including all his early formation, was spent in Florence. And the last 25 years have really seen a remarkable building of a sharpened sense by Dante's scholarship, and of greater analytical purchase on what it meant for Dante to live in Florence in this period, to engage with some of the key intellectual figures in the Florentine milieu, and to engage with potentially sites of learning. Much of this work in the last 25 years has been led or inspired by Zygmunt and some of his students at Notre Dame, but it's also received sustained input by scholars working in Italy, France, Switzerland, Germany, and the UK. Happily, thankfully, Dante studies is like that. We've built a sharpened sense, for example, of the role of Brunetto Latini, Latini's ethical, political, and rhetorical program, built on classical writers, Cicero, Aristotle, the moral Seneca, and the way that Latini inflected them to the present, And at the same time, we've built a sharpened sense of some of the borrowings, but also some of the profound differences and some of the stances that Dante was taking in relation to Brunetto Latini already in the 1290s. We've concentrated attention in new and acute ways on the sites of learning within Florence and the book holdings there, above all with the friaries of the Dominicans at Santa Maria Novella and the Franciscans at Santa Croce. We're steered to these institutions by Dante himself in a celebrated passage from the Convivio, Convivio 2, 12:7, where he refers to himself after the death of Beatrice in the early 1290s, frequenting the places where philosophy is taught in le scuole delle religiose, the schools of the religious, and le disputazioni delle filosofanti, the disputes of the philosophers. We've begun to refine our understanding of the book collections held in these convent schools, not as libraries accessible to Dante, but still interesting for their book holdings. And we've also begun to examine closely the lecturers present there, the contents of discussion, the materials used, the role of, in particular, quodlibetal disputations, that is, theological disputes, debates that were open to the laity, to a much broader public. And I recall, again, and happily, it was my last visit to Notre Dame, the excellent conference workshop organized at Notre Dame on precisely this topic, quodlibetal disputations, by Paolo Nasti and Lorenzo Dell'Orso 2 or 3 years ago. So we're embarked on a bottom-up approach to studying Dante's formation. And as part of that, we've begun to study more intensely preaching, preachers' handbooks, other kinds of study materials, other kinds of compendia. Methodologically, we're gaining a better sense of the thickened, more material worlds of philosophical, theological inquiry in Florence at this time. And we're recognizing that we don't do down the great poet Dante in this way, but that actually a localized based knowledge approach is very helpful indeed. After all, Dante, like all great creative artists, was remarkably attuned to ideas in the air. And I think Carol was alluding to this in some of the questions yesterday with reference to Bologna. Of course, there are many, many gaps. There probably will always be many, many gaps. And we still need to understand better the traffic of ideas, books, and people between Florence and Bologna. That nexus is a crucial one. We need to study better Bologna book holdings, the religious studia there, the relationships between studia in Italy, and the relationship between the studia and the University of Bologna, the role of private collections of books, of medical writers in Bologna and other practitioners. And moving outside of Florence and Bologna, again, I think we still need to understand better the cultural environments, some of the other key phases of Dante's exile, Lucca, Verona, Ravenna in particular, understanding the transmission and circulation of key texts, commentaries, ideas, teachers in those places. But I don't want to keep pondering what's lost and fragmented. I want to turn to the text we have. And first, Dante's Libello, his little book, the Vita Nuova, composed 1293-94, Dante's first self-commentary on a selection of his own earlier poetry, and one that's increasingly been shown to have a really rich and sophisticated engagement, not only with its local Florentine context, but with a range of other fields of reference as well, especially in its prose. The work coincides with the chronology that Dante gives us in the Convivio about his first intensive studies of philosophy and theology, and to some extent we find the imprint of this there in the Vita Nuova, but actually in a very interesting and attenuated form. And I need to manipulate my PowerPoint a little. So, for example, Dante makes reference to astronomical and medical law, often in interesting, quite sustained ways in the prose of the Vita Nuova. But his actual references to philosophers and scientists from the ancient world are really, really quite limited. There's one reference to the astronomer Ptolemy, just two to Aristotle, both times referring to him as il filosofo, the philosopher. both passages, there's one in chapter 25 on the local motion of bodies, and then there's a further one in chapter 41 dealing with the ways in which the sight of the human perception of the blessed is like a weak eye to the sun. They've both been studied afresh by Deleuze in a Notre Dame dissertation supervised by Zubaransky. And Deleuze very, very helpfully has shown how Dante's use of Aristotle at this point, early 1290s, is very closely based on compilations and summarized forms of Aristotle's text, not on a direct engagement with the texts. There's another good suggestive study by Andrea Robiglio in a similar vein, studying the role of excerpted quotations from authorities in philosophical texts as well. And it looks like Dante is working within that kind of context at this point. With exile, though, we're talking about the beginning of the 14th century now, the situation changes, and to some extent changes radically. We find a rich sense of the ferment of this in Dante's invigorated and direct engagement with philosophy and philosophers in the Convivio, his unfinished vernacular commentary on 3 of his own lengthy poems. This work, the Convivio, reveals a real explosion of reading, contacts, and interests. It's not for nothing that several scholars have recently hypothesized that the Convivio, or parts of it, were written in the Bolognese milieu. In book 3, philosophy is defined, and there's a veritable hymn to lady philosophy, the Donna Gentile, Dante creating a really remarkable construct motivated by a whole nexus, an intricate nexus of philosophical, biblical, and literary traditions. Such is the complexity of this construct that we're still grappling with its precise orientation and significance. The allegorical sections of the 3rd book make dramatic assertions about lady philosophy, about how she manifests the presence of the creator God. They make strong claims for the compatibility between the rational truths of philosophy and the revealed truths of religion. And these chapters are steeped in complexities concerning the relations between divine wisdom and earthly philosophy, and the limits and jurisdictions of human knowledge in this life. I'll try and work some of these things up in the written version. Amongst the philosophers in the Convivio, Aristotle is given a remarkable primacy. Let me move to the next slide. So we get something like maybe 100 references to Aristotle in the Convivio, between the reference to Aristotele and Il Filosofo. We now have, unlike the Vita Nuova, specific quotations, specific teachings, paraphrases, alongside the more diffuse use of terminology and techniques of scholasticism that owe much to Aristotelian teachings. We also have a really richly appreciative tone of celebration. Aristotle is il mio maestro, my master. He is quel glorioso filosofo al quale la natura più apersi I suoi segreti, that glorious philosopher to whom nature most opened its secrets. And I've given you more examples of such praises on the slide. Double check I'm on the right slide. Yes, I am. At the same time, though, the Convivio shows a wide reading, bringing the presence of other philosophers: Pythagoras, Epicurus, Zeno, Democritus, Socrates, Plato, Seneca, Islamic philosophers Avicenna, Al-Ghazali, and others. Important to note that Dante, of course, he didn't read Greek, he didn't read Arabic, but he quotes, admires, and draws on Islamic philosophers and polymaths. Al-Ghazali is the leading Muslim theologian and philosopher of the 11th century. Avicenna, major philosopher, also medical writer. Averroes too. I will come back to both Avicenna and Averroes in a moment. Dante also makes use of Islamic astronomers, Al-Furganus and Al-Bumazar as well. A major intermediary for Dante here is a Dominican theologian, Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great, whose commentaries and paraphrases on Aristotle or related to Aristotle mediate Aristotle to Dante in really complex ways. And Dante is reading these clearly in the early years of exile. Albert presents us, he's not the only one, but he presents us with a strongly hybrid Aristotle with Neoplatonic and Arabizing inflections. Albert is also the source for many of the Islamic philosophers that Dante knows and uses in the Convivio. And Albert is a figure whose voracious intellectualism and integration of Arabic philosophy are truly remarkable. I'll just give you one slide that, again, and I'll leave this on, that just helps you to see how explicit and programmatic Albert is in drawing in those philosophical traditions within his commentaries. And this is a work on sleep and wakefulness that Dante knew well. He quotes in the Convivio. The Convivio often takes what one might call a markedly doxographical approach to philosophical issues and to philosophers. Starts say from Aristotle, works through a range of different philosophical views from different schools. I mean, Dante does this time and time again. I mean, I'll just give you one example here, because I want to get back to the Commedia, which is an example from book 2 of the Convivio, the allegorical exposition of the word cielo, heaven, which Dante understands to mean science. And as part of this explanation for this transference of meaning, one reason he gives is the way that the heavens, like the science, impart, transmit perfection, induce perfection. And note how here he provides various views of philosophers on the roles of the heavens imparting perfection, moving through Plato, Avicenna, Al-Ghazali, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and other peripatetics. Okay, enough of early exile. Let's move now to the Commedia. The first major passage I want to consider comes from the first circle of hell, Dante's Limbo, Canto 4 of the Inferno. As colleagues will know, Dante fashions in his Limbo a remarkably complex and highly original imaginative construct. He doesn't simply present the more standard theological doctrine of the limbo of the fathers, with the righteous of the Old Testament awaiting the coming of Christ, and the limbo of children for unbaptized infants. He does have those two categories, but what he does in addition, and this is the real originality, is he creates a whole set of categories with great attention to them for virtuous pagans, pagans whose virtue and achievements in the active and contemplative realms mark them out for a special kind of reverence and honor. Entry into limbo is still a descent into a world of darkness and punishment. That's clear. It's a cieco mondo, a blind world in which angoscia, some anxiety, pain of some kind is felt. But the suffering is subtly characterized as pain without actual martyrdom, actual punishment. And again in the canto, especially in the second half of the canto, the emphasis falls on the outstanding qualities of deserving pagan illustrious souls who were without faith and are punished for this, but are nonetheless most honorable for their deeds and their actions and their thoughts. Near to the midpoint of the canto, a fiery light is espied. The very presence of light is significant. Dante character sees, meets, and famously is welcomed by and becomes part of a school of ancient poets. The slide I'm showing you is one example of this from 15th century illumination. Exclusively human worth is celebrated then through a whole series of presentations of ranks of figures from antiquity. Great souled individuals who acquired renown in literature, the active life, and science and philosophy. Perhaps the best known passage is, of course, the one involving the 5 ancient poets who welcomed Dante into their fold. But I'm most interested in a further transition that comes from line, I'll show you another slide which better represents, this comes from the 1481 Landino print edition, which shows you better the Here, this is the Philosophica Familia, here in the center of the slide, with Aristotle sitting down at that point. So what I'm interested in is the transition to a scene with, from line 106 onwards, with a noble castle, nobile castello, with 7 gates and a green meadow. Within that noble castle, there are 35 further named pagans. And the noble castle section is really, really notable for its innovation at multiple levels. It rewrites in a Christianizing and Romance key Virgil's Elysian Fields. It couples the active and the contemplative. It blends ancient and modern. It blends to Greek, Roman, and Islamic. It is open to female figures as well. I'm most interested in the 21 philosophers and scientists named in 5 tercets from lines 130 onwards. And let me show you that, give you that slide now. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on this. There are so many things to note here. I won't read because it's good to get through to discussion. But what I want to say are really 4 blocks of points about the souls who appear here. They're quite clearly connected to a celebration of scientific and philosophical doctrina, intellectualism. First point is the primacy, the intense celebration of Aristotle's philosophy, and the concomitant subordination of Socrates and Plato. A lot of later writers have problems with this passage. They're troubled by it, not least since it cuts against some celebrated passages in Cicero and Augustine that Dante probably knew well, where Plato is the divine philosopher who comes closer to Christianity, far closer to Christianity than Aristotle. But none of that for Dante. Aristotle is celebrated in that pithily resonant phrase, il maestro di coloro che sanno, the master of those who know. The memorability and longevity of this formulation, they're really remarkable. If you look hard at Italian 16th century prose, you'll find it time and time again, laced through prose narratives, prose treatises, but probably the most celebrated later appearance is, of course, Joyce's Stephen Dedalus on the seashore in the Proteus episode, where Joyce quotes Dante's words directly in what I understand to be, but happy to be corrected, the first direct, untranslated quotation in Joyce's fiction. Second point, Philosophica Familia, yeah, philosophical family. Pay attention to that. I want to come back to family at a number of points in my talk. That may well be a precise, or be alluding to precise technical language. Cicero uses the Latin term familia to refer to sects of philosophies at various points in a range of works. And I found some later examples in commentaries on Martianus Capella. And again, I'll probably investigate further. It's one of those examples of where Dante being very, very precise at these points, not noted in commentaries. Third point, so characteristically Dantean, is the careful symmetry. 1 tercet just to Aristotle, so 1 group of 3 lines just to Aristotle, a further group of 3 lines to celebrate his primacy through mentions of Plato and Socrates, then 3 further tercets with 18 figures, 7, 5, and 6, each tercet naming 1 figure in particular for whom we get a more tantalizing comment on either their theories or their works. Democritus, Dioscorides, and Avarius, respectively. 4th point is the conspicuous syncretism and a hybridity on display here. Again, so characteristically Dantean. Pre-Socratic philosophers, poet theologians, geometers, astronomers, medical writers, pharmacologists, Arab philosophers, even, I mean, probably at least 12, strictly 12 philosophers here. And discuss that. So after Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates, we have a group of 7 pre-Socratic philosophers: Democritus, Diogenes, probably Diogenes the Cynic, Anaxagoras, Thales of Miletus, Empedocles, Heraclitus, Zeno, probably the Stoic, not Zeno of Elea, And broadly, Dante doesn't know these thinkers directly. He's picking up references, multiple references to them in Aristotle, in contemporary Aristotle commentary, and possibly in compendia of various kinds too. Another tercet with 5 more figures, the most mixed one. First, the great Greek botanist and pharmacologist Dioscorides. The reference there to the qualities is the medicinal qualities of plants and minerals in Dioscorides De Materia Medica. Then Orpheus, poet theologian par excellence. Linus, another poet and musician. May seem strange, but for Augustine, both those, but they are both the theological poets of antiquity. They are both paired in Augustine. They're paired too in Virgil. Think about Virgil's 6th eclogue. Then we get Cicero the philosopher. Again, one of these big areas that we still, as Dantists, need to explore precisely what the role of Cicero the philosopher in Dante is. And then Seneca Morale. And again, there's a big dispute about this line. Probably unlike Cicero, Seneca being read often, the moral Seneca being read indirectly or mediated in other ways. But I think Dante certainly did know a scientific philosophical treatise by Seneca, The Natural Questions. Final tercet, Euclid and Ptolemy, the geometer and the astronomer, amongst other things. Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna. Looks like that's medical teaching. And then, shock of shocks, well, for us at least, Averroes, yeah? The presence of the Islamic scholars, Avicenna and Averroes, very, very interesting. Dante had certainly read Averroes' commentaries directly. He was certainly aware of the debates surrounding Averroes' teachings at the universities of Paris and Bologna. Come back to this later. Gran Commento, again, is very technically precise, I think. Remember that Averroes compiled 3 main kinds of commentary on Aristotelian texts, and the Commentarium Magnum is the one in which the Aristotelian text is quoted fully with detailed commentaries. So absolutely crucial, these lines in all kinds of ways. Just move to my next slide. And just to say, en passant, already 50 years after Dante's death, for commentators like Boccaccio and Benvenuto d'Imola, even stronger than Boccaccio, this was a real problem. Yeah, not just the Islamic scholars, but the Islamic scholars and Averroes, who so impudently and impiously blasphemed Christ, according to Benvenuto d'Imola. What on earth is he doing here? How can Dante do this? How can Dante put him here? Now, of all the philosophers we find mentioned in Limbo, there are actually very few further explicit references in the Commedia. That in itself, I think, is significant. Yeah, but all the references are consciously crafted, and what I want to do is track through them. Do that with various speeds, relatively quickly in some cases. Starting with a conspicuous but implicit allusion to Empedocles in Inferno 12, then explicit references to Aristotle and Plato in Purgatory 3, then a further implicit reference to Averroes in Purgatory 25, and finally another explicit reference to Plato in Paradise 4. When I've tracked through those references, I want to return to another familia, Dante uses that precise word, in Paradiso 10, the heaven of the sun, for one other reference to a Christian philosopher, Siger of Brabant. So my first passage from Inferno 12, between my text and PowerPoint, is spoken by Virgil as guide, with reference to an earthquake that took place on Christ's death when Virgil is already in limbo, yeah? That caused great braken stones to be found at the entrance to the circle of the violent that Dante is entering with Virgil at this point. Virgil explains his own reaction to this earthquake, yeah, as a soul in limbo, and he does so very intriguingly, very crucially, within a frame of reference that is eminently pagan, cosmogonical, philosophical. The reference here is to the Empedoclean theory of a universe ruled by successive cyclical regimes of strife and love governing the cosmos. Several times the world converting into cosmos. Virgil thought this was the case. Someone believes that at this point. It might seem just like a sundry detail, just like a minor embellishment, but this is part of a pattern of interventions by Virgil character, where he provides explanations for Dante based on rationalizing pagan learning. He does it in Inferno 6, 7, 11, in more complex ways still in Purgatory 17, 18, and he steers Dante character to do so too. Two prominent examples of Dante character being steered to do that are Inferno 6 and Inferno 11. I'll just show you the slides of these. Inferno 6, Dante character being told, well, you need to get back to your science, the science you understand, where science is to be understood as Aristotelian natural philosophy that can be applied by Dante to allow him to understand how souls in the afterlife at resurrection might feel more pain and suffering at these points. So Virgil very, very prominently signaling Dante to go back to Aristotle at these points. He does it even more prominently, more directly, with texts in hand. And these are, note that reference is just one of two, that Dante needs to go back to his Ethica, la tua etica, your ethics. Dante, you need to go back to that book at this point if you want to understand the things that I'm telling you. So Virgil making absolutely clear that Dante's mental baggage, Dante's library, at least his mental library, these are his books, is built around Aristotle at these points. And I think that's important. That's a key strand in the development of Dante character's mental tools and the way that the poem works on those over time. The next, and I'll keep this slide on a little bit longer, and it's really important. The next reference to philosophers is explicit, and it's to the two of the key Greek philosophers from Limbo, of course, Aristotle and Plato. It comes in a scene of remarkable emotion and pathos. The beginning of Purgatory 3, Dante, the character, the pilgrim, thinks that Virgil is still guiding him, or inexpertly at this point guiding him, has deserted him because he only sees one shadow on the ground, his own cast by the sun. Dante doesn't realize, or he forgets, that as a spirit, Virgil's got no body to impede the light, so there's no shadow there, the sun just passes straight through. And Virgil's response, so attention is drawn to bodies and the fact that Virgil has a kind of aerial body. Virgil's response to this is to remind the pilgrim that his actual body, Virgil's actual body, is on earth, it's buried, and that God, who's referred to by a circumlocution as the power, la virtù, line 32, has provided souls in the afterlife with immaterial aerial bodies that suffer torments in ways that are hidden to human understanding. Virgil develops here the theme of the limits of human reason by evoking the unfathomable mysteries of the Trinity and the Incarnation, and then going on to stress how Plato and Aristotle could not know everything, and that their desire to do so is in vain. It's felt by them as a painful loss in limbo. As a result, humans should be satisfied with the bare facts, the quia. They shouldn't inquire into the causes of things. In Limbo, of course, Aristotle was singled out and outshone Plato, but now Dante places the philosopher really in parallel with his teacher at the very moment when the stress falls on the limitations of them both and of reason in the face of divine revelation. And it's interesting that the Incarnation becomes a kind of almost a litmus test, a test case for showing the limits of rationality alone in the poem, for exploring what it means to see with more than human eyes, for probing that nexus between the finite and the infinite. And note again here in that passage from Purgatory, that amazing passage from Purgatory 3, the emphasis on desire. L'ordisio quietato is not quietato, che eternalmente è dato lor per lutto. Yeah, so their desire that's frustrated, and that frustration is given to them in limbo as an eternal pain and suffering. Lutto has a strong sense here of pain or suffering, and crucially too, it is used of Lucifer in Inferno 34. Yeah, pain and suffering in Dante is never about the creation. The creation of things, divine creation of things is lieto, is happy, but lutto is something used about Lucifer at that point. So this is a theme that Virgil returns to later on in Purgatory 7. I don't know whether I've got the text from Purgatory 7. It doesn't matter. When he refers to God as the high sun, note the metaphor, who is desired by his interlocutor, one of the expiating souls, another poet, Sordello, at this point. And again, we return to limbo, to the state of the souls in limbo at that point, and with emotional poignancy to Virgil's own state. So I don't think this is the only recall, Purgatory 3, of limbo in this canto. When later in the canto, a group of newly arrived penitent souls appear, they're compared very famously to sheep in a celebrated simile, obviously with biblical antecedents. But it's notable how the presentation is so different from those worthy souls of limbo in their ranks, and ranked and differentiated. And I think that contrastive recalls may well be operative here, is suggested by the repetition of key rhyme words from Inferno 4, 131, 33, 35, with Purgatory 80, 82, 84, that rhyme set, stanno, fanno, sanno. And also, perhaps more importantly, it's because they don't know, the souls here compared to sheep don't know the reason why, non sanno il perché, that in their humility and honesty and togetherness, they flock together. They're another kind of family, yeah? They may not be a philosophical family, but they are a mandra fortunata, a truly fortunate flock. So I think there's all kinds of complex revisiting of the Philosophica Familia at that point. Aristotle not named again in the poem, possibly a couple of subtle allusions to him in Paradise 8 and Paradise 25, interesting ones, but I don't want to dwell on them. But of course, Aristotelian ideas, mediated and enriched by late medieval scholastics like Albert the Great, but also Thomas Aquinas, they continue to inform the poem's teachings on the soul, on perceptual theory, on how reason regulates the senses, on the formation of the human body, on aspects of the cosmological framework. And more diffusely, medieval Aristotelianism provides Dante with all that philosophical underpinning that I was describing at the beginning, a set of intellectual tools, argumentative procedures, rich material for his lexical and stylistic choices, even particular kinds of imagery, yeah? And even the opening and closing verses of the Paradiso have echoes of Aristotle, of the notion of God as unmoved cause of movement. Purgatory 18 is a really good example of these elements. But it would be misleading to think of Dante as an Aristotelian at several levels. And again, that's why I don't want to project Dante as philosopher here. I certainly don't want to project him as peripatetico either. Misleading for a number of reasons. For a start, the culture, the philosophical, the complex philosophical culture that Dante was in contact with already blended and enriched and hybridized Aristotle with Neoplatonic and Christian elements. And Dante himself does that in his own way and with his own syntheses much more. That doesn't mean, though, that within the narrative, Dante character isn't presented as thinking like a peripatetic. I think at that level, that is the case. He's often thinking in naturalistic ways, searching for causal explanations in line with Aristotelian teachings. And that's why those two earlier passages with Virgil pushing him towards Aristotle are significant, I think. They're not asides. And it's a motif that continues into the earthly paradise and through the opening cantos of the Paradiso, where Dante learns to correct this kind of peripatetic mindset, where he seeks explanations based on material causes alone, and is taught to see and look for spiritual causes for certain kinds of phenomena, like his flying through the heavens in the opening canto of Paradiso, or like the moon spots that are not actually related to rarity and density, but to the relationship between divine power and its differentiation throughout the whole cosmos. So alongside Dante's own kind of retraining, Dante character's own retraining, as the Commedia progresses, we get, I think, an increasing strong emphasis on correcting intellectual error. The Commedia becomes a kind of space where conscious and unconscious errors are resolved, authority is delimited in various ways, and the pilgrim, of course, emerges as an eyewitness, one who sees truth and then writes it down, has privileged access to the truth that is so confused on earth. And again, it's that eyewitness quality and that prophetic quality that become the basis of the veracity of the poem and its message. A good example of this kind of correction is the next passage, where the discourse in Purgatory 25, where Statius, a saved Christian soul at this point, tells us about the generation of the human body, the divine creation of the rational soul, and the way that after death, a new aerial body is fashioned for each soul from a residual formative power that remains in each soul at death. This is the discourse that Virgil couldn't do in Purgatory 3, crucially. At one crucial point in the discourse, Statius moves from describing the natural generation of the human body. All of that is built on Aristotle. It's all built on Aristotle's ideas on the generation of animals, to describe the creation of the rational soul. And at that point, he refutes an error, someone who is errante, offering a correction of this doctrine. But note how he does it in a tone of deep respect, just like Limbo to some extent. Più savio di te, someone wiser than you. And I think it's most likely that this is an implicit reference to Averroes, who had maintained, of course, the existence of a pan-human material intellect, a single human intellect, which was common to all of humankind and located outside the body, and thereby denying individual immortality. So Dante absolutely, or through Statius, making that clear. As I've said, only a couple of elusive recalls of Aristotle in Paradise. The one philosopher in Paradiso who is explicitly named, who comes from the noble castle of Limbo, is Plato, intriguingly. The passage comes about, and again, let me just go down. The passage comes in relation to Dante having a doubt, Dante character having a doubt about, and Carol touched on this yesterday afternoon, having a doubt about, how can it be that the blessed souls there, they should really be in proper heaven, in the 10th heaven, the Empyrean. How can they descend to the planetary spheres and come and talk to me like this, just as Picardo Donati had done in the previous canto? And in rendering Dante's doubt to the reader, Beatrice refers to the Sentenza di Platone, Plato's teaching, Plato's statement, the idea that the souls pre-exist their bodies, are mounted on stars, that they descend into the bodies, and that they may then return to the stars if they have lived well, Timaeus 41 DE. But probably to Dante mediated by Macrobius, or by Boethius at this point. I think it's probably unlikely that Dante knew the Timaeus in full, but it's a moot point and an open question. What's interesting is that Dante resolves the issue of any potential heretical charge in this passage by stressing that we need to look for deep meaning, yeah, sentenza, yeah. That's different from the surface meaning, yeah. We need to look at the deep metaphorical structure of this philosophical work, pagan philosophical work, not the literal sense. If we do that, we'll interpret it not as a literal return of the souls to the stars, but as the influence of the heavens on human personalities. And so within the structure of the Paradiso, souls descend to a heaven that has some kind of astrological impact upon their personalities, their predispositions, much softer kind of doctrine. Dante's approach to Plato here is indebted to what one might call integumental, if you can forgive me that word, reading of pagan texts. In other words, the idea of reading below the surface cover, the dress, the garments on the surface of the text, the pleats and the folds of a text, getting under that to the core of the text, to its husky kernel of truth. And integumental reading is one way in which, of course, pagan philosophical and scientific teachings can be accommodated with Christian orthodoxy. And I mean, one can easily compare this passage, I'm not going to show this, with the way and other scholars have done it. 12th century thinkers in commentaries on Plato, Boethius and others dealt with this idea, interpreting it astrologically as implying that the praise or blame for talents in human personalities lies with planets. So, you know, reading in an astrological key. I mean, it's interesting that Dante is harking back potentially to a strand within 12th century philosophical culture. That's where this kind of mode of reading is most pronounced. But what interests me too is that the only time, the one and only time in the Paradiso that Dante explicitly recalls a pagan philosopher from that philosophica familia is to raise a question of error, even of heresy, and then to accommodate it to Christian teaching. And I think it's more interesting still that Plato's teachings are then built into a broader sequence, rich in implications for questions of interpretation, the role of metaphorical language, how language mediates transcendent revealed truth to humans, what the very structure of the Paradiso is. But I'm near the end, and I want to end with, sorry, I should have shown you one other slide, yeah, where Dante explicitly mentioning the Timaeus at that point, yeah, and referring to la sentenza being of another kind than the words alone say che la voce non suona, and relating it to the ruote, the heavenly spheres, and their influence on human dispositions. So I'm quite close to the end, just another couple of minutes. Ending with the Heaven of the Sun, block of cantos from 10 to 14, which really remarkably showing how the poet balances all kinds of currents of knowledge, rational and non-rational, how he maps them into and onto the poem, how he ponders these forms of knowledge and their relationship to the divine. The whole block of cantos opens with a celebration of the order and creative power of divine wisdom, so opening with the Trinity. And throughout the block of cantos, there's a constant and intricate orchestration of oppositions that are harmoniously reconciled. What's really crucial too, and I'll come back to my opening comments, is the sustained use of motifs of circling, gyration, concord, dance, an astonishing battery of light and solar imagery. We're in the heaven of the sun after all, emphasizing the harmony in this heaven, all of which is in pointed, bleak, stark contrast to what knowledge is on earth. Knowledge on earth being ideological rifts, intellectual animosity, using one intellect to pursue not the benefit of others and oneself, but money. Dante saw this all around him on earth, plus ça change, one might say. what Dante sees in this heaven then are 24 spirits, extraordinarily diverse in era, nationality, and approach. They appear in two circles, actually semicircles. The first circle, and crucially, they are referred to as a familia, la quarta familia dell'Alto Padre. Yeah. The first one, and I won't go in detail through them. I'll say a little bit about them just as I conclude. The second one, again, my second slide, giving you a sense of who those figures are there. The spirits of the wise, they are not a philosophical family, but the family of the High Father. Yeah, and again, one can't help but think of Limbo and of Purgatory 3 there. The High Father, l'Alto Padre, satiates, satisfies this family of soul. There's no question about desire being unfulfilled here. And he does that by mostrando, showing that, yeah, his Trinitarian aspects, how the spirit love is breathed out and how the Son wisdom is generated in heaven. The Son absolutely full of this imagery and Trinitarian imagery. Some of these souls are organizers of knowledge, Peter Lombard, Peter of Spain, Gratian, Hugh of St. Victor. Others are collectors of information in encyclopedic form, Isidore of Seville, the Venerable Bede, Rabban Maurus. Others are intellectuals, interestingly, like Albert the Great, Aquinas, Bonaventure, Anselm, Sidra of Brabant, who to varying degrees and in varying ways either incorporated or reacted against the deployment of rationalizing concepts and methods in theological inquiry. But we also get a mystic, a grammarian, a historian, an orator, two humble Franciscans, and we also get antagonists in life showing now to be united in a common purpose to celebrate God. In all these ways then, Dante dealing with the intellectual past and contemporary intellectual concerns, displaying his concern with harmonizing, displaying his interest in the value of certain kinds of voices. And the key voice, of course, will be Solomon, a divinely inspired voice and a poetic voice as the most learned light in all of these heavens. Dante stressing too humility, the risk of shipwreck through excessive self-confidence. We need to do much more work on these cantos. Even though lots of work has been done, it would be great to have a book on these cantos. And as I say, I think Dante's overall vision of philosophy and philosophers can't be understood without taking it back into account the way the canto richly connects up with the Philosophica Familia in the Inferno 4 and with those references to Plato and Aristotle in Purgatory 3. The final philosopher, I really am at the end now, is a contemporary figure, Sidra of Brabant, the Parisian master of arts, who developed the Aristotelian idea of the autonomy of each domain of knowledge in a way that could justify a kind of rationally grounded natural philosophy and ethics in spite of disagreements with revealed truth. Note how Dante talks about him syllogizing truths. Syllogism is fine. These are truths that make him envied, even hated. He identifies precisely the place where he taught. This is taking us to the faculty of arts. This is an arts faculty teacher, so someone teaching natural philosophy. And he celebrates Sidra, what one might call Sidra's intellectual martyrdom, yeah, at this point. Scholarship has in the past emphasized how unorthodox this choice is. And I think there's a danger of overplaying that. What's clear is Dante's syncretistic urges here, probably in ways that defy classification. A number of issues and questions remain to be discussed, and they need our attention in this block of cantos as a whole. I just draw one final comment. Paradiso 13, within the Heaven of the Sun, stresses within Thomas Aquinas's discourse there, explaining the wisdom of Solomon, the need to make distinctions, to proceed carefully, the dangers of erroneous thinking, a faulty method, of faulty philosophical claims, the risk of shipwreck. And just before the shipwreck imagery that's used and that records Ulysses at the end of the canto, interestingly, again, we find 3 more pagan philosophers. They're not inhabitants of limbo, but they could have been. Notable for their false premises, invalid methods, and syllogisms. Parmenides, Ulysses, and Bryson. Again, drawing on Aristotle at this point. I'll end there. Thank you very much.